So picking up from where we stopped last week, we had just finished talking about the Chesapeake, and so now we're moving to New England, which is comprised of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine. London merchants, headed by Thomas Weston, who had watched the failure of the joint stock company that tried to start Jamestown, all the investors in that joint stock company went bankrupt, decided that instead of running a colony in a new country, they would instead negotiate agreements with individual groups wishing to settle in America. The first group to sign on with them was comprised of 24 families. The council arranged for their ship, the Mayflower, and provided them land. In exchange, these settlers promised to send back to England and the council lumber, furs, and fish for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, the land would then belong to them. About half of the expedition's leaders were made up of separatists. These were Puritans who had given up trying to improve the Church of England to their way of thinking, and instead left England and fled to the Netherlands. The Dutch welcomed the Puritans, but as time passed on, they began to fear that their children were becoming too Dutch and were unhappy with the liberality of Dutch society. So they decided to take up the offer of the London merchants and immigrate to America. By November 1620, the Mayflower lands at Plymouth Bay. Weakened by the journey and unprepared for the winter, half the colonists die that first winter. In the spring, 2 English-speaking Native Americans helped the rest to survive. They are Squanto, a local Patuxent Native American who had been found by the English plying the fishing trade off the coastline, crossed the Atlantic in English trading ships, had been captured by the Spanish, eventually escaped the Spanish, and made it back to Newfoundland. Eventually, he returned to his village, only to find that most of his people had died from European contact due to diseases. Samoset was an Abenaki Native American from Maine and also had had experience trading with the English. These 2 Native Americans taught the Pilgrims how to grow corn, and they also helped the colonists make an alliance with the local Wampanoag Native Americans. Keep in mind the English are the much stronger partner in this alliance, and they demonstrate that during the event that we now call Thanksgiving. In 1622, news of the Virginia massacre caused the colonies to militarize under Miles Standish. The Pilgrims also quickly entered into the fur trade with the local Native Americans. Their alliance with the Native Americans led the colonists to trade surplus corn for furs. This allowed them to discharge their debt to their English sponsors. The sponsors, however, had cheated the colonists so badly that the 7-year obligation had grown by an additional 15 years. By 1627, though, the fur trade had increased enough that the Puritans actually had to divide the fur trade in New England with the Dutch. By the time Plymouth Plantation became a free colony, it had several hundred people living on Cape Cod and the southeast corner of Massachusetts, which you see right there. King James I had focused his threats on the separatists, which forced the Pilgrims to decide to leave for Holland. But his son Charles I took a hostile stance toward all Puritan reformers, even those that stayed in England. After 1625, systematic persecution combined with a growing economic depression in England led many Puritans to consider the long ocean voyage to America. Massachusetts Bay Colony, like Plymouth, was self-governed rather than a joint stock company. In 1629, led by a 23-year-old lawyer and landowner, John Winthrop, influential Puritans formed the Massachusetts Bay Company and applied for a charter to establish a new northern colony. Wiser than the previous colonists, Winthrop and the company sent an advance crew of 400 Puritans to build shelters and clear fields. In 1630, a great fleet of Puritans arrived at Boston Harbor, led by Governor John Winthrop. By fall, 6 towns had sprung up within the modern-day boundaries of Boston. In the first winter, 30% die, 10% return home in the spring. But by mid-1631, another 1,300 settlers arrive, and the colony will flourish. The motives of the Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans was very distinct. They wanted to create a model society where Christian charity and mercy would rule their economic dealings. They wanted to be an example to English society, hoping when England witnessed the success of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the reforms that they made to their society and to their church, that England would follow suit. The people living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were highly disciplined people with a very set agenda. And if you couldn't live by that agenda, you were often asked to leave the colony. The government, as I said, was in America, not England. Voting rights were not based on land ownership, as in England and in Virginia, but on church membership. Every adult male who was accepted as a saint could vote. In 1644, that meant that 55% of men could vote, which is a very high percentage in colonial England. The other element that was unique to New England governance was the establishment of town meetings. In England, the local unit of government was the county court, presided over by a justice of peace and appointed by the crown. He handled legal cases, also assessed taxes, and did administrative duties. In New England, county courts were primarily just courts of law. Local government administration took place in town meetings. In each town, the men of the families who received land grants decided how the settlement would be laid out and the organization of the church. Equally important was education. Remember, the Puritans are Calvinists. They're trying to read the Bible and see glimmers in their lives that indicate to them that God has preordained them to salvation. So literacy was necessary to be able to read the Bible. Young children needed to also be able to read and study the Bible. The Puritans kept diaries to record their spiritual growth and their failings, and in 1647, to encourage reading and writing throughout the colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted the Old Deluder Act, which ordered every town of 50 households or more to appoint one teacher, and every town of 100 households to create a grammar school. No laws required attendance, and boys were more likely to attend than girls. But there was an emphasis on education, causing New England to have a higher literacy rate than some of the other colonies. Massachusetts developed into a society of small farming villages and small seaport towns. Puritan colonists believed these close-knit settlements would help them create model Christian communities. They had no compelling reason to sacrifice communal life for the isolation of a large plantation anyways. The region's short growing season and rocky soil meant no profitable staple economies could develop. They created village life similar to that they left behind in England. The result was a hub-and-spoke design that you see on the left-hand side of this slide, with houses cluttered tightly near a village green or common pasture, and the church and meeting house would be beside this green. Each family was allowed 1-acre plot, enough for a garden, within half a mile of the meeting house. Small fields for cultivation and land stock would be further out. An individual could own several parcels of land, but usually at different locations, so that nobody was getting the best land. This design set a natural limit on the size of any village or town, because beyond a certain point, usually measured in a winter's walk to church, a farm family was considered outside the community circle. As town populations grew and farmlands at the outer boundaries became the only available sites, villagers on the outer rim of the town usually chose to create new communities for themselves. This process was called hiving off. So you can see the difference between the clustered village of New England to the more distant plantations of Virginia in this image. Conflict arose between the New England colonists and the Native Americans over the use of land. Remember that Native Americans and Europeans loved the land differently, as one historian has said. Native Americans did not believe in owning land. They understood that they were just using the land. They thought when they offered land to the Europeans that they were just allowing the Europeans to use the land for a limited amount of time. The English, of course, being Europeans, thought they had purchased the land and they owned title to the land for the rest of their lives. In addition, in the way that Europeans cultivated the land and the way they built communities, they actually changed the landscape and the environment of the land. Also, the way they allowed their pigs to run loose caused havoc with Native American farming. And so these conflicts increased tensions between Native Americans and Europeans, hurt alliances, and actually led to warfare. Dissent within the Massachusetts Bay Colony led to the formation of another New England colony, Rhode Island. Roger Williams was well liked in the colony and was a devout Puritan. He felt that the church and state should be separated. He didn't want this separation for religious toleration, but because he thought that it was harmful for the Puritan religion to force unsaved individuals to come to church, that the mingling of the saved and the unsaved would lead to contamination. So he opposed compulsory church service. In 1635, the Massachusetts Bay Colony brands him as subversive because of his arguments, and he's banished. But because he's good friends with the governor, Governor Winthrop, he is told to go south. He goes with 4 companions to what will become Rhode Island, buys the lands from the Native Americans. More dissenters will follow. True to his belief, Rhode Island was the only New England colony to practice religious tolerance. Anne Hutchinson was another New England dissenter. She was the wife of William Hutchinson, who arrived with his family in Boston and soon established himself as an important figure in the mercantile life of the colony. Like many Puritan families, the Hutchinsons had followed their minister, John Cotton. After establishing themselves in New England, Anne began to hold weekday meetings at which she gave an oral synopsis of the preceding Sabbath sermons for the benefit of women who had been unable to attend. In the privacy of her home, she created an atmosphere of informality and encouraged her listeners to seek clarification on difficult points. Her meetings grew in popularity. Soon men as well as women, Sabbath keepers as well as absentees, sought out her home, and the numbers necessitated a second weekly session. Now, none of this was necessarily dangerous. Laymen were still encouraged to seek God's will on their own in the Bay. But the return of Pastor John Wilson in October 1635 caused a change in the character of Anne's meetings. Wilson's sermons disturbed her in a way that John Cotton's had not. Wilson placed a strong emphasis on human actions as a means of preparation for God's grant of saving grace and as evidence of sanctification. John Cotton, Anne's mentor, de-emphasized preparation in favor of stressing the inevitability of God's will. Now, these two positions are not very far apart. They're really just a matter of different emphasis. Neither Wilson or Cotton believed that good works would help a person earn salvation because they're Calvinist. They believe in predestination. But Anne felt there was a difference. She interpreted Wilson's sermons to be saying that good works would earn you salvation. So she soon began to criticize Wilson in her private meetings. By the summer of 1636, the meetings in Hutchinson's household were attracting individuals of considerable status, and Anne had broadened her criticism. She began to argue that not only Wilson in Boston, but all the clergy of Massachusetts, except for Cotton and her brother-in-law, were preaching a covenant of good works rather than a covenant of grace. She denounced Wilson and most of the Bay's clergy as no longer being true to the faith, and she encouraged the true saints of the church not to listen to what in her mind was heresy. So she was challenging the authority of most of New England's ministry. She unleashed a struggle over theology and over political control in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So much so that by 1636, the colony had split into 2 factions. The Antinomians, made up of women and merchants who disliked government regulation, and young men who were tired of rigid control of the church. These were followers of Anne's. In 1636, they were strong enough to elect a governor from their own camp. However, by 1636, the next year, John Winthrop is reelected and he's back in control, and the Orthodox members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were ready to take on Anne and the opposition. The rise of Anne Hutchinson seemed to indicate to the Orthodox clergy that the doctrinal structure of Puritanism was too loose, and that it allowed too much freedom for untrained minds like Anne and her followers. So a synod was called in 1636. A synod is an assembly of ministers. So assembly of Puritan ministers got together to discuss, define, and point out 82 errors that they felt needed to be guarded against by the faithful Orthodox Puritans. Most of those errors were opinions that had been attributed to Anne and her followers. They also concluded that private religious meetings should be discouraged and that the critical questioning of the clergy should be forbidden. The errors of the dissidents having been demonstrated, the synod proceeded against the Hutchinsons. Anne was arrested, tried, and found guilty. She and her leading followers were banished. Others followed voluntarily. Some went to Rhode Island, New Hampshire, or returned to England. Anne Hutchinson led the largest group to Rhode Island. Anne's uprising and the trial that followed had consequences for Puritan society. There were more restrictions on women's independence. There was less equality in congregational matters between women and men, and women were no longer allowed to relate public conversion experiences before the church. They had to do it privately with a minister because women speaking in public were seen as dangerous. That leads us to the middle colonies. Between the Chesapeake and New England lay the vast stretch of forest and farmland that was called New Netherland. It was a Dutch colony that was home to settlers from Holland, Sweden, Germany, and France. Eventually, Charles II of England will seize this land from the Dutch and carve out 3 colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. But because this area started as Dutch and Swedish colonies, this makes the area one of the least English and most pluralistic regions in British America. This area was heavily involved also in trade, not only throughout Europe, but the Dutch were heavily involved in the slave trade. And so New York is going to have one of the largest slave populations in the North. Pennsylvania. This is another proprietary colony where Charles II paid off a large debt to one of his supporters by giving the last unallocated land to his supporter's son, William Penn, in 1681. Penn had reasons for developing this colony. He wanted to launch a holy experiment based on his Quaker beliefs. He wanted to extend religious freedom while still making a profit. Quakers were a religious sect in England that was founded by George Fox after the English Civil War. He developed his theology while wandering war-torn England and witnessing the distress of the common people. It's a religion that appealed mostly to men and women from the lower classes of England. They were named the Society of Friends, but people called them the Quakers. They were among the most radical of religious sects in the mid-17th century England. At the core of Fox's teaching was the belief that the Holy Spirit or an inner light could inspire every soul. At Quaker meetings, men and women sat quietly until the inner light moved someone to speak. They believed in the equality of individuals, which is going to make them some of the earliest voices who speak out against slavery in England. Many of the Quaker beliefs put them at odds with the social hierarchy of England. They refused to tip their hat because they felt people should be judged by their character, not by their wealth. They wore hats in court, which was considered disrespectful. They refused to take oaths. They were pacifists, so they refused to bear arms. And they accorded women equality. All of these actions put them at odds with English society, which was very hierarchical. Now, not all Quakers were commoners. They did also attract well-educated, well-to-do individuals like William Penn. Quakers were often persecuted in England and often jailed. Even Penn had been jailed for his religious beliefs. So Penn arrives in 1682 to this proprietary colony he's been given, and he chooses Philadelphia for the capital. It becomes known as the City of Brotherly Love. By 1687, the colony had increased to 8,000 settlers, most of them Quakers, but also because of the religious toleration that had been promoted by Penn, the colony attracted Presbyterians, Baptists, Anabaptists, Anglicans, Lutherans, and radical German sectarians. Because the Quakers immigrated in families, birth rates rose quickly and the population grew. Penn designed a government with a strong executive branch and gave only limited powers to the lower branch. The Quakers dominated the elected assembly. Penn chose the governor, the judges, and the sheriffs, and named Quakers to all those positions. Pennsylvania's political structure reflected Penn's Quakers' egalitarianism. All free male residents had the right to vote. Penn's land policy also reflected Quaker principles. Unlike many proprietors, he wanted no politically powerful landlords and no economically dependent tenant farmers. He actively promoted a society of independent land-owning farm families. He heavily controlled land sales to avoid disorderly wrangling over the land. He also insisted that all land be purchased fairly from the Native Americans, and he pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence between the two cultures because the Quakers are pacifists. He took an active role in making Pennsylvania a multicultural society, recruiting non-English settlers through pamphlets that stressed the religious and political freedoms and the economic opportunities in his colony. Philadelphia quickly emerged as a great shipping and commercial center. It rivaled the older seaports of Boston and New York City. But the success came at a cost to Penn's original vision and to his Quaker principles. The commercial orientation of Pennsylvania attracted colonists who were more secular in their interests than the colony's founders. These colonists had no strong commitment to egalitarianism. For example, many newcomers saw Penn's Indian policy as a check on their ambitions and preferred to seize the land from the Native Americans rather than purchase it. The demand for military protection from part of the colony became a major political issue and a matter of conscience for the Quaker legislators, whose religious principles included pacifism. Eventually, many Quakers chose to resign from the colonial government rather than struggle to uphold a holy experiment that their neighbors did not support. Out of Pennsylvania was carved the colony of Delaware. And that brings us to the lower South. William Penn was not the only Englishman to benefit from the often extravagant generosity of King Charles II. During the 1650s, settlers from New England and the English West Indies had established unauthorized outposts along the swampy shoreline between Virginia and Spanish Florida. In 1663, the king surprised 8 of his favorite supporters by granting them these outposts, along with several million acres lying south of Virginia and stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This gesture by Charles was both grand and calculated. France, Spain, Holland, and the Native American tribes that inhabited these areas all laid claim to it, and Charles thought it would be wise to secure England's control of the region by colonizing it. The 8 new colonial proprietors named their colony Carolina to honor the king's late father. In 1669, Anthony Cooper, one of the proprietors, sped up immigration to the colony by offering head rights. In 1670, 200 English settlers from Barbados landed near modern-day Charleston. At Charleston, they made their capital and established their own bicameral legislature distinct from that in the north. In the 1690s, rice was introduced by slaves from Senegamia to Carolina. Rice, like sugar grown in the Caribbean, enriched a few men wealthy enough to build a costly system of dikes and dams, plus the labor needed to grow the rice. By earning annual profits of 25%, those that could afford to become rice planters were able within a generation to become the only colonial elite whose wealth rivaled the Caribbean sugar planters. The main problem for rice growers was that indentured servants could not survive in the rice fields. They kept succumbing to malaria. The planters solved this problem by importing slaves from the Caribbean and then also Africa to serve as their labor force. 15% of those slaves supported had cultivated rice in Africa, so they brought an expertise to the rice growing enterprise. Also, unknown to the planters, many of these slaves had an immunity to malaria through the sickle cell trait, so they seemed to survive better in the rice fields than the Europeans had. Rice called for a greater number of slaves than any other colonial crop. Carolina was Britain's sole mainland colony with a black majority. As a result, whites responded with harsh laws regulating slaves and their treatment. Many slaves died from the brutal treatment, but they also died from the long hours in the hot, wet rice fields. In 1719, Carolina split into North and South when the Southern District overthrew proprietary rule and became independent. They felt they had received little help from the proprietors in making Carolina what it was. The northern region of Carolina had developed in the shadow of its southern neighbors. Bordered by the Great Dismal Swamp to the north and by smaller swamps to the south, this isolated area did not attract many colonists. Some poor farm families and freed white indentured servants drifted down from Virginia, searching for unclaimed land and a fresh start. They had modest success in Carolina growing tobacco and producing naval stores, or hemp, which was grown to make rope. In 1729, the Albemarle colonists followed the lead of their elite neighbors around Charleston and rid themselves of proprietary rule. Then these North Carolinians went one step further. They officially separated from the rice-rich southern section of the colony. The Crown recognized their rebellion and made 2 royal colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. Georgia is the last colony to be formed before the Revolution. It is also the only mainland colony to be chartered and created by Parliament. In 1732, Parliament founded the Georgia colony. They intended Georgia as a refuge for bankrupt debtors. Debtors in England were usually sent to debtors' prison until they could pay off all their debts. The problem was being stuck in prison. It was hard to raise the funds to get yourself out of debt. So English prisons were filling up with debtors. Parliament thought here was a way to empty out those prisons, get the debtors back to work so that they could pay back their creditors, and also have the colony serve as a protective barrier between Spanish Florida and rice-rich South Carolina. The colony's sponsors hoped Georgia would make money by exporting expensive commodities such as wine and silk. They even invested money to ensure the success of the colony. This is the only North American province, except for Nova Scotia, that Parliament does so. James Oglethorpe was made head of the Provincial Board of Trustees, and he shaped Georgia's first decade. He founded the port of entry at Savannah in 1733. 7 years later, 2,800 colonists had settled in the colony. Half had come from Switzerland, Germany, and Scotland. Most had had their passage paid by the government, but very few of them were debtors. So Georgia starts out as the least English, most international of all the colonies. Oglethorpe hated slavery. He felt slaves lived like cattle, and if the board promoted slavery, they would be doing the opposite of their original charter to relieve the stress of the poor of England. He felt slavery degraded Africans, made Europeans lazy, and presented a risk due to slave rebellions. Most of all, he felt slavery contributed to making the economic standing of poor whites even worse because it cut labor demands. At Oglethorpe's insistence, Parliament makes Georgia the only colony where slavery is forbidden. He also pushes through a requirement that land holdings could be no larger than 50 acres to avoid the rise of a ruling planter elite. Oglethorpe's plans failed completely. Few debtors ever arrived because of the stringent rules Parliament had set for their release from jail. Limitations on land and slavery kept immigrants away. Raising exotic commodities proved impractical as well. Only rice and cotton along the coastline seemed to do well in Georgia. In 1750, the trustees finally legalized slavery. After 1750, the Georgia population exploded, and Georgia became a success. It went from 4,000 people in 1750 to 23,000 people in 1770. 45% of that population, however, were African Americans, most of them enslaved. So Georgia was the last British settlement along the Atlantic coast. British expansion would stop until the 1760s, when settlers began to push over the Appalachian Mountains. And this leads us to the beginning of Chapter 3. I'm not going to do all of Chapter 3, but I thought I'd start with the political problems that existed in England that have been alluded to as we were talking about the settlement of the colonies. England experienced some severe political problems in the 17th century. King James I was Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen's nephew. Remember, she had no children, so he succeeds his aunt. He was originally James VII of Scotland, but when he ascends the throne of England, he becomes known as James I because he's the first James to sit on the English throne. When he ascended the English throne in 1603, he had already been King of Scotland for 36 years, and there he had ruled by the divine right of kings, whereby kings were appointed by God and so were not answerable to men. This style of government was unacceptable to the English with its constitutional and parliamentary history. This led to great conflict between the king and Parliament and would continue to cause problems for later Stuart kings. Although James was a Protestant, he was not willing to make the major reforms that the English Puritans were agitating for. He actually angered the Puritans as well as much of England when he arranged for his son, Charles I, to marry a French Catholic princess. Charles I, the second son of James I, was never expected to be king, but became heir to the throne after the death of his older brother Henry in 1612. Charles inherited his father's belief in the divine right of kings and never wavered from that doctrine, even though it will cause his own death. As a result, he was obstinate in his political dealings and constantly quarreled with his parliaments, ruling without one for 11 years. The rivalry between Parliament and the monarchy gave rise to the English Civil War, one of the greatest upheavals in British history. This was not just a political issue, but also a religious issue, with Puritan forces lined up against the pro-Catholic Charles. Oliver Cromwell, a leading Puritan, designed what he called the New Model Army. His soldiers were indoctrinated and impassioned by sermons, prayer, and song. In June of 1645, anti-royalist forces capture the king. Disagreements between the different factions within the anti-royalist camp result, but eventually the radicals win. The king is tried, he's found guilty of crimes against his subjects, and he's beheaded. Cromwell then declared England a republican commonwealth without a monarch or a House of Lords. So that from 1649 to 1660, Cromwell and the Puritans will run England. At Cromwell's death, most Englishmen are tired of the Puritans and tired of the Commonwealth, and they ask Charles I's son, who had escaped to France, to return and take over the throne. This leads to the period known as the Restoration Monarchy. Charles II's reign, though, was uneasy. In 1685, on his deathbed, Charles is received into the Roman Catholic Church. His brother, James II, would ascend the throne. James II had decided to restore Catholicism to England, and his policies led to conflict with the Church of England and with his Protestant Parliament. James was a Catholic, but he had two Protestant daughters by his first wife. Their names were Mary and Anne. Mary was married to William of Orange of the Netherlands. William of Orange was a leading Protestant monarch. He had been fighting the French and the Spanish for years. When James remarried in 1673 to Mary of Modena, and they had a son, a potential Catholic monarch, this intensified conflicts. So within 6 months of the son's birth in 1688, James and his second family were forced to flee into exile. The English invited William and Mary of Orange to England to restore English liberties, to restore the Protestant Church. This period is known, or this move is known as the Glorious Revolution, because there was no bloodshed and Protestantism was safeguarded in England. It was arranged that William and Mary would rule jointly. Religious and political peace finally came to England. All of these political events had ramifications for the colonies, but especially for New England. Both Pilgrims and the Puritan leaders were affected by the political and religious changes. From the beginning, of course, Puritan migration to New England had been prompted by Charles I's hostility to dissenters. When Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan armies challenged the Stuart king in 1642, many Massachusetts Bay Colony settlers rejoiced. Some even chose to return to fight in Cromwell's armies. Throughout the decade, the population shrank in Massachusetts because they didn't have to be a shining example to England anymore. England was embracing the Puritan experiment. In the post-Civil War years, Massachusetts faced a crisis. The Stuart Restoration was the demise of Puritanism in England. It also left American Puritans without that sense of mission, and the religious commitment that accompanied it seemed to be declining in the colony. Few new saints migrated to the Bay Colony after Cromwell's victory or during the Restoration era. In fact, most of the newcomers in the 1660s were not Puritans at all, but Anglicans or members of other Protestant groups interested in economic opportunities, not religious ones. The Bay Colonies could not prevent them from settling as they had done in the past because King Charles II would not allow it. At the same time, the colony experienced internal problems. Second-generation American Puritans were not willing to undergo the rigors of conversion relation to become a saint. And if you were not a saint, your children could not be baptized. Suddenly, the first-generation Puritans were forced with the prospect of grandchildren who were not baptized. The problem was made worse by the growing demands of prosperous non-Puritan men who wanted an active role in government. And of course, the only way to be active in Massachusetts government was to be a member of the church. So in response, in 1662, a convention of clergy and laity created a compromise known as the Halfway Covenant. It permitted the children of baptized parents, including non-saints, to be baptized. It allowed saints to transmit memberships to their non-saint children, but it was only a halfway membership. When faced with the option of having only a small minority of saints being members or including a majority of the community, purity was sacrificed for community. Sainthood gradually diminished the rest of the 17th century. Pressure from England could not be dealt with so easily, however. Charles II was not pleased that the colony sometimes ignored English civil law if it conflicted with biblical demands. In 1683, Charles insisted that the Bay Colony revise its charter to weaken the influence of biblical teachings and eliminate the unusual voting requirements. The Massachusetts government said no. And with that, Charles revoked the charter. Massachusetts remained in political limbo until 1685 when James II came to the throne, and then things got worse. In an effort to centralize administration of his growing American empire, King James II revoked the charter of every English mainland colony and in 1686 combined several of the northern colonies into one large unit under direct control. He called this new region the Dominion of New England, and it included Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Plymouth plantations, and the newly acquired colonies of New Jersey and New York. James expected the Dominion to increase his opportunities for patronage that he could provide to his local supporters. He also expected to increase revenues by imposing duties and taxes on colonial goods in the vast region he now controlled. What James hadn't expected was how strongly the colonists would resent and resist the change and the man he sent to govern them. Sir Edmund Andros was given the job by James II to anglicize New England, to make it more like England. He immediately did that, but immediately offended the Puritans by establishing the Church of England as the official religion of the new colony. He also alienated many non-Puritans by abolishing the representative assemblies there. These men had been struggling to be included in the assembly, not only now to have the assembly abolished. Andros's tactics united Massachusetts colonists who had been at odds with each other. One sign of this came when the Dominion governor imposed new taxes. Saints and non-saints refused to pay them. When the Boston citizens received the news of the Glorious Revolution, they imprisoned Edmund Andros and shipped him back to England to stand trial as a traitor to the nation's new Protestant government. But William and Mary did not reward the Puritans as they had expected. True, William and Mary abolished the Dominion of New England, but they did not restore the Bay Colonial Charter. In 1690, they made Massachusetts Bay Colony into a royal colony with a governor appointed by the Crown. The new royal colony included both Plymouth and Maine. Voting rights were granted to all free males who met the standard English property requirements. Church membership would never again be a criterion for citizenship in the colony.